Hey guys, welcome back. This is an exciting video because I am finishing this sketchbook. Finally. Actually, I shouldn't say finally because it's pretty common for me to take a year or maybe a little more to finish a sketchbook. And I started this one in September 2018, so not too bad. Also, I just recently replaced my white and black gouache with Winsor & Newton designer's gouache, and I have to say that I am really loving it. It's very, very creamy. It's brand new, so I haven't had to deal with any like odd things happening when it's coming out of the tube like my old Holbein tubes. But yeah, I've been enjoying it, so I can already recommend it. Now for this painting, I wanted to go back to my Colorado days, which I mean wasn't that long ago. I moved to Scotland in December 2017. So this photo was a photo I took before I moved, and I think it was during the peak leaf color season in autumn. So up in the mountains, the aspens turn bright yellow and orange, and it's just absolutely gorgeous, especially when you're in a pine forest because you see like these little dots of color. So I wanted to capture a little bit of that in the photo as well. But I especially loved the huge cloud that was kind of hiding part of the mountain and the big shadow that it cast across the pine forest, especially on the upper left. And so in order to achieve that, I just got the paper wet with clear water, and then I started touching in very minimal amounts of color into the shadow side of the cloud and the blue sky that was peeking through the clouds on the upper left. And while that was still drying, I would come back in with a little bit more of a thick application of paint and paint in those mountains. And some edges were on the dry paper while other edges were touching that soft cloud area. So it ended up being a little bit more soft right there. And I feel like that's kind of hard to do with gouache. I struggle with that, especially not being super familiar with doing that wet on wet with this moleskin paper. A lot of it is just that water control. So the more you do it, the easier it gets, or the more familiar you get with it. So if I practice a lot, I'm sure it would be much better. But yeah, just like knowing when to do it, when the paper is dry enough for you to start touching it in, versus being too dry where you're not going to get any soft edges. When I was looking at the color of this photo, I decided to alter it a little bit for the painting. And that's something that I do quite often is, I don't know, like try to remember what it was like in person versus just blindly going off a photo. And I remember how warm the stone color was, even in the distance. That cloud created a big shadow on the mountain, but the stone itself felt like more of a warm gray, whereas in the photo it just almost looks all bluish gray. And that's just something that photos do. So that's why ideally you're painting outside, plein air painting. It helps you see color so much better. But the shadow side of the trees definitely is more of a bluish tone, and that shows in the photo. So like a really quick, just easy way of doing trees, especially like a big, vast tree covered landscape like this, anything that's in shadow is more blue, and anything that is in sun is more warm, and like you'll add more yellow to it. And it doesn't always work like that, but it's just like a quick little technique that you could try, and it could apply to so many different types of landscapes too. Like I'll throw in a couple of photos here of where the sun is casting big shadows on the land from the clouds. And for the most part, you can achieve that effect by either making those shadow areas a little bit cooler or making them a little bit of a more deep tone of the adjacent sunny color. And one thing I was doing here to fill in that giant section of trees, since I'm not going to sit there and paint every single little tree, was just to use bigger more full brush strokes full of color, but apply it in kind of like a jagged, rough way where the bristles are touching it in different angles and it's not allowing me to smooth it out completely. It just like gives it more of a loose, rough texture. And as the eye looks at it, even if you squint a little right now, you'll start to see it blend together and it's gonna look more like a forest rather than just like a smooth, flat green thing in the distance. You can also do this like splatter technique, which will just add a variety of texture to it, visual texture. But I think that's one of the cool things about this whole sketchbook, and using a giant brush like this for most of the paintings has forced me to get creative with my mark making and just trying things I never would have thought of before to achieve a certain look. Now that I'm down in the foreground, I'm switching to bright, warm colors to kind of push that atmospheric perspective a little further. So now everything in the distance will appear much more cool and a little bit more faded since I used lower contrast back there. And in the foreground, I'll just be using more of a combination of red, tan, beige, and yellowish tones. So for the rocks, I just did a base coat of the mid-tone that I saw in them, which is like a pinkish tone, and then I can come back in and do the shadow side and the highlight side. And I didn't really wait that long between the layers on the rocks, which meant that this pinkish tone was still a little bit wet when I started to apply the shadow tone. So the edges will be like just a tiny bit soft, which can work to my advantage. I don't know, it depends on what like look you're going for. If you want it to be like really chunky and blocky, which I also love, then you'd want to wait for it to dry between the layers. But if you are going for more of a combination, or, you know, working fast like I was working on a tight 10-minute deadline, you just go for it. Just do it. Maybe try loading your brush a little bit more with pigment and seeing if it sits on top of the paint and hopefully it doesn't blend in too much. So I added a little white to the shadow color, which meant that it was going to dry lighter, because pretty much anytime you add white to your paint, it's going to dry lighter. And sometimes your darker colors dry lighter in general. So I knew that I needed to come back in with a deeper tone for some of the shadows and like really just make the little crevices between the rocks pop out. So I used a little bit of some black and more of a raw reddish blue tone in some areas. But my whole goal was just to get like a loose rock bed look there. So not sitting and like trying to render each one in very, very high detail, but like doing more generalized brushstrokes that the viewer can just kind of see quickly as rocks. At this point, I think I had about 2 or 3 minutes left to go on my timer, because I was trying to keep it under 10 minutes. So I was rushing a little bit with the rocks, and I wasn't super happy with how they turned out, but they did the trick. For the foreground trees, I wanted to go a little bit more bold. And you can see here that I left some of the white paper showing through because I knew that I was going to be painting the trees with a little bit more of a bright orange-ish, yellowish green tone. I just didn't want to waste paint and like paint over everything in the background. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, yeah, I'm pretty stingy with my paint, but in this case, it was also because the color in the foreground was going to be so light compared to the background that there was no point in painting in the whole thing in the background. So I started off with just the typical tree trunk and tree branches because I wanted a little bit of that darkness of the bark to be showing through in the end. So working from darker to lighter in this case was my strategy. Like a little more cool tone, a little more cool green color applied, and then slowly building up the warmth to make it pop away from that background. And in the past, I've talked about this where if you're using this technique of layering your gouache, you have to get thicker and thicker and thicker as you go. So with this final layer of bright yellow leaves, I had to go really thick in order for it to actually sit on top of the background paint and not blend in. So I picked up a huge glob of yellow on my brush and just dotted it all over the tree. So by now I was running out of it on the brush. As you can see, it was getting a little bit more dull. But basically, that was the strategy: was scoop up that paint and just like plop it down on the paper and let it sit and just like let it dry, let it do its thing. Don't blend it in. And in the end, it actually worked. It worked out. However, I will say though, sometimes you can get a little too thick with gouache, and depending on your paper or depending on the type of gouache or how much water you have, it can actually get so thick that it'll flake off the paper. So it just takes some experimenting to find out what will work for you and for your situation. And I've done it in the past in these sketchbooks where I've used white really, really thick on like a waterfall. And I close the sketchbook, I get home and find that like a bunch of the white gouache had dried and cracked off of the paper. It still had enough on the paper to make it look like a waterfall, but it wasn't quite as bold as it was when I was painting it. So just something to think about. So I think that pretty much wraps up this painting. I'm actually gonna be back soon with a full sketchbook tour of this gouache sketchbook. So if you're interested in seeing all of the paintings, I'm gonna go like to do a flip through of the book as well as showing a couple close-ups of the textures, and hopefully I'll have a couple little videos interspersed. We'll see, but that kind of video takes a lot of editing time, so bear with me. I'll try to get it out soon. But yeah, otherwise I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend and stay inspired. I'll see you guys soon.